On the evening of May 15th, 2019, Ethan Wallace, a 27-year-old rookie park ranger, stood at the edge of the Appalachian Forest in upstate New York. It was his first solo assignment, surveying an underexplored section of the forest known for its rugged terrain and sparse foot traffic. The job had sounded exciting when he'd first taken it, a chance to prove himself in a field he was passionate about. But standing there, staring into the darkening woods, he felt an uneasy tension in his gut. The Appalachian Forest wasn't just another stretch of wilderness. Locals regarded it with wary respect. It was beautiful, no doubt, but its dense trees and tangled, winding trails had claimed many hikers over the years. The stories ranged from mundane explanations, getting lost, underestimating the weather, to the more sinister, whispered only after a few drinks at the local tavern. "It's not just the forest that gets you," one old man had muttered to Ethan a week earlier. "It's what's in it. People go in there and something changes." Ethan had laughed it off then, but now, alone and staring into the forest's endless green canopy, the words came back to him. He shook his head, trying to dispel the creeping doubt. His job was simple: document the condition of the trails, note any signs of erosion or overgrowth, and make sure the area was safe for future visitors. He wasn't here to chase ghost stories. With a steadying breath, he adjusted the straps of his pack, gave a quick whistle to his dog, Scout, and stepped onto the trail. The late spring air was crisp, with the crisp scent of pine and wet earth. Scout trotted ahead, his nose close to the ground, tail wagging lazily. The rhythmic crunch of Ethan's boots on the trail and the occasional chirp of birds were the only sounds as the forest closed in around them. For the first hour, everything was uneventful. The trail wound gently through groves of towering oaks and maples, their leaves filtering the golden light of the dwindling sun. Ethan made notes in his logbook as he went, jotting down areas where the trail markers were faded or overgrown. Scout stayed close, occasionally sniffing at the base of a tree before bounding back to Ethan's side. As the sunlight dwindled, the forest began to change. The cheerful chirping of birds quieted, replaced by the distant rustle of leaves. The air grew sharply cooler, and Ethan found himself zipping up his jacket. Scout also sensed the shift. His ears perked as he stopped to sniff the air. Ethan glanced at his map and realized they were nearing a section of the forest marked only as clearing. It was a spot he'd been curious about. The map showed no defined trails leading to it, just a blank space surrounded by dense woods. As they approached, Ethan noticed something odd. The trail was littered with faded, time-worn relics, an old rusted canteen, a torn piece of fabric, and what looked like the shattered remains of a hiking pole. He crouched to examine them, his brow furrowing. The items looked decades old, but their placement felt deliberate. They weren't scattered as though dropped accidentally, but seemed almost arranged, as if marking a path deeper into the woods. Scout's growl broke the silence, snapping Ethan's attention forward. The dog stood rigid, his gaze fixed on something up ahead. Ethan followed his line of sight and froze. Just off the trail, partially obscured by overgrown ferns, was an abandoned campsite. The tent was collapsed, its fabric faded and torn, barely clinging to its frame. A rusted metal fire pit sat in the center of the site, surrounded by decaying logs that might have once been used as seats. Ethan approached cautiously. His hand hovered near the knife on his belt. Scout stayed close, his growl fading to a low whine. As he stepped into the clearing, the air grew colder, and the crisp scent of pine was replaced by a sharp, iron-like scent. Ethan scanned the site, his flashlight piercing the surrounding gloom and revealing more unsettling details. A weathered backpack leaning against a tree, its contents spilled out. Clothes, a broken compass, and a few cans of expired food. Near the fire pit lay a small notebook, its cover warped and stained. Ethan picked up the notebook, flipping through its damp pages. The handwriting was erratic, fragmented. At first the entries were mundane, descriptions of the weather, notes about hiking routes. But as he read on, the tone shifted. The writer spoke of feeling watched, of hearing voices at night. The final entry, written in shaky script, read, "The clearing is not what it seems. If you find this, turn back. Don't let it follow you." An abrupt shift in the underbrush made Ethan spin around, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Scout barked sharply, the sound echoing through the still forest. For a moment, Ethan saw nothing but shifting silhouettes of trees. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A figure just beyond the edge of the light. It was too quick to make out clearly, disappearing into the darkness as soon as it appeared. Ethan's pulse quickened as he scanned the area, but there was nothing. The forest resumed its unnerving stillness, as if daring him to move forward. He took a steadying breath and clipped the notebook to his belt. "Come on, Scout," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get out of here." Scout hesitated, but eventually followed as Ethan turned back toward the trail. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing in closer, their branches clawing at the sky. Every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. The sensation of being watched clung to him, heavy and unrelenting. Ethan quickened his pace, each step feeling heavier than the last. Scout stayed unusually close, his ears pinned back and his tail tucked low. The air felt stifling, the piercing cold biting at Ethan's exposed skin, even though it was supposed to be a mild spring evening. The image of the figure lingered in his mind. Was it another hiker? A poacher? Someone who had been living out here? Rational explanations offered little comfort. Whoever it was had deliberately stayed out of sight, and that was enough to unnerve him. The trail twisted steeply upward, forcing Ethan to slow down. His breathing grew labored, each exhale visible in the cold air. As he climbed, that sharp, iron-like scent from the campsite lingered, stronger now, clinging to his senses. It wasn't just in the air, it seemed to come from the ground itself. He stopped and knelt, shining his flashlight down. The soil had a faint reddish hue, and when he touched it, his fingers came away damp. Blood? No, it couldn't be. He rubbed his fingers together, noting the gritty texture, and decided it was likely iron-rich soil, but the thought did little to calm his nerves. Scout barked sharply, breaking the silence and pulling Ethan's attention ahead. The dog was staring at something again, his body tense, his hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, gripping the handle of his flashlight like a weapon. He followed Scout's gaze and saw it, just barely visible in the distance, a weak, wavering glow beyond the trees. It wasn't steady like a flashlight. It pulsed unevenly, as though a lantern was swaying in the wind. Ethan hesitated. He'd been hoping to encounter another person, someone who could explain the strange happenings in the forest. But now, faced with the possibility, his gut screamed at him to turn around. Still, his sense of duty as a ranger pushed him forward. "Stay close," he muttered to Scout, and together they moved cautiously toward the glow. As they got closer, Ethan realized the light wasn't coming from a lantern. It was a torch, planted firmly in the ground at the center of a small clearing. Its flame danced erratically, casting long shadows that snaked and contorted around the surrounding trees. The clearing was empty except for the torch and a pile of abandoned items. Ethan's flashlight revealed a haphazard collection, a torn jacket, a water bottle, and a pair of hiking boots caked with mud and half buried in the ground. Beside the pile was something that made Ethan's stomach drop, a rope, frayed and weathered, hanging from a low branch. It swayed slightly, though the air was still. Scout growled low in his throat, his body rigid as he refused to step any closer. A prickle of unease crept up Ethan's neck. The scene before him was too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had arranged these items. But why? An abrupt snap from behind made him whirl around. His flashlight darted across the trees, but he saw nothing. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the sound of leaves rustling faintly in the windless air. "If someone's out there, I'm with the Park Service," he added, trying to inject authority into his tone. "You're not supposed to be here." Silence. Then faintly he heard it. A voice. It was distant and muffled, barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. "Ethan!" He froze. The voice wasn't loud enough to pinpoint, but it sounded familiar. Could it be Ray? The thought brought a shred of relief, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion. Ray shouldn't be here. He hadn't mentioned anyone else working this section of the forest. And the way his name was said, drawn out almost like a sigh, sent a cold unease spreading through him. Scout barked again, louder this time, snapping Ethan out of his paralysis. He turned and hurried away from the clearing, back toward the trail. The voice called his name again, closer now. Ethan didn't look back. He pushed forward, a surge of adrenaline propelling him as he tried to put as much distance as possible between himself and the torch. The trail twisted sharply, and Ethan skidded to a stop. Just ahead, standing in the middle of the path, was a man. The beam of Ethan's flashlight illuminated him fully. A tall figure in his mid-40s, with a scruffy beard and a heavy jacket that looked out of place in the season. He held a hunting knife loosely in one hand, its blade glinting in the light. The man's grin widened, a disconcerting edge to it. "Didn't think I'd see anyone else out here," the man said, his tone light, almost conversational. But his smile was wrong, too wide, too empty. Ethan's grip on his flashlight tightened. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to sound calm. "Just a guy out for a walk," the man replied, taking a step closer. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right?" Scout let out a low warning growl, stepping closer to Ethan. "I'm with the Park Service," Ethan said, keeping his voice firm. "You're in a restricted area." The man's grin widened. "Oh, I'm sure. But you don't seem too sure of where you're going, do you?" Ethan didn't answer. His instinct screamed at him to back away, but he held his ground. "You need to leave the area," he said, his voice firmer now. "This isn't a safe place to camp." The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off the trail, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he'd appeared. Ethan stood frozen, listening to the sound of the man's footsteps fading into the forest. Scout barked once, sharply, before falling silent again. Ethan's hands trembled, his knuckles white around the flashlight, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Whoever that man was, he didn't belong out here. And he was far too calm for someone in such an isolated, unnerving place. He glanced at Scout, whose tail was still tucked between his legs, and made a decision. They weren't stopping. Not until they were far away from this section of the forest. Ethan moved quickly down the trail, the man's unsettling grin lingering in his thoughts. His flashlight bobbed with every step, casting shadows that crept toward him, encroaching on the path. The suffocating stillness of the forest made his footsteps sound unnaturally loud. Even Scout, usually bold and curious, stayed close to Ethan's side, his tail low and his ears pinned back. The trail began to incline sharply, forcing Ethan to slow his pace. His legs ached with each step, but he didn't stop. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every few moments he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the man from the trail, or something worse, emerging from the darkness. As he rounded a bend, the trail opened into a small clearing. He froze. In the center stood another torch, its flame flickering wildly in the still air. The clearing was smaller than the one he'd seen earlier, but the arrangement was eerily similar. Scattered around the base of the torch were more items, a dented canteen, a shredded backpack, and a pair of hiking boots. But this time, there was something else, a frayed rope dangling from a low branch, swaying faintly as if recently touched. A wave of dread prickled Ethan's skin. Scout growled low, his body tense. Ethan shined his flashlight around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still. He took a hesitant step forward, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something about the scene compelled him, whether it was his training as a ranger or sheer morbid curiosity, he didn't know. He crouched near the torch, his flashlight illuminating the scattered items. The boots were old, the soles worn almost smooth. The backpack was partially unzipped, revealing a few crumpled maps and what looked like a metal flask. Ethan hesitated, then reached out to pick up one of the maps. The paper was damp and fragile, but he could still make out faint markings. Several locations along the trail were circled in red ink, including the clearing where he now stood. Scout barked sharply, startling Ethan so badly that he nearly dropped the map. He turned to see the dog staring into the trees, his body rigid. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. He shined his flashlight in the direction Scout was looking, but the beam revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth. Then he heard it, a guttural, resonant rumble, too deep to belong to any animal he knew. It came from somewhere in the forest, too far to see, but close enough to feel. The sound seemed to vibrate through the air, sending a cold unease spreading through him. "That's enough. We're leaving," Ethan muttered, backing away from the torch. He stuffed the map into his pocket and turned back toward the trail. But as he took his first step, a voice rooted him to the spot. "Ethan?" It was faint but unmistakable. Someone calling his name. His heart raced as he scanned the darkness, his flashlight beam quivering with his unsteady grip. The voice came again, louder this time and closer. "Ethan? Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. He gripped the flashlight like a weapon, ready to swing it if he had to. Scout growled again, baring his teeth, but the dog didn't move from Ethan's side. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the guttural rumble returned, this time layered with the sound of measured footsteps breaking the fragile silence of the forest. Ethan backed away, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to run, but he couldn't bring himself to turn his back on whatever was out there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing. Ethan strained to see, his flashlight darting over the trees. Then from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was a man from the trail. A wave of dread hit Ethan. The man stood just beyond the torchlight, his features cloaked in shadow, but Ethan could see enough to know it was him. The same scruffy beard, the same heavy jacket, and the same unsettling grin. This was the wrong path to take, the man said, his voice calm and measured. Ethan steadied his breathing. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head, his grin widening. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you brought." Ethan's grip tightened on his flashlight. "I don't know what you're talking about. Leave now, or I'll—" "You'll what?" the man interrupted, taking a step closer. His voice dropped to a whisper, though it carried through the clearing like a shout. "It doesn't matter. You can't stop it." Scout's frantic barking jolted Ethan into motion. He didn't wait for the man to move again. Turning on his heel, he sprinted back toward the trail, Scout close on his heels. His pounding footsteps seemed deafening in the silence, but he didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. The man's voice followed him, laughing softly as it faded into the distance. Ethan didn't stop running until his legs burned and his lungs felt ready to burst. He stumbled to a halt, leaning against a tree as he struggled to catch his breath. Scout stood beside him, panting heavily but otherwise unhurt. The forest was silent again, as though nothing had happened. But something had. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the map he'd taken from the clearing. His hands shook as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the circled locations. One of them stood out, marked with a single word written in shaky, uneven letters. Cabin. A sick unease settled in Ethan. He had no intention of finding out what the map meant, but as he folded it back into his pocket, he realized he might not have a choice. Ethan didn't dare linger. The encounter with the man, the guttural sounds, and the strange clearing had pushed his nerves to the edge. He had to leave this part of the forest. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted the straps on his pack and started down the trail again, his flashlight scanning the path ahead. Scout stayed close, his posture tense and alert. The forest felt heavier, the darkness pressing closer. The trees intertwined above, blocking out what little moonlight might have filtered through. Every sound, every crunch of a leaf, every creak of wood made Ethan's pulse quicken. His mind raced, replaying the man's cryptic words. "You can't stop it. Stop what? And what did he mean by Ethan bringing something? A mile or so down the trail, Ethan slowed. His legs were starting to give out from the relentless pace, and Scout was visibly exhausted. They needed a moment to collect themselves. Ethan leaned against a tree, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill in the air. He glanced at his watch. It was well past midnight. Just a little farther, he whispered, as much to himself as to Scout. The dog gave a soft whine in response. Ethan pulled out his map again, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. He shined his flashlight over the marked locations. One of them was unnervingly close, so close, in fact, that Ethan realized he must be heading straight toward it. His eyes settled on the single word scribbled next to the circled location: cabin. A cold dread seeped into him. He'd seen no sign of any structure so far, and the thought of stumbling across a cabin in this increasingly hostile forest was anything but reassuring. He debated turning back, but the thought of retracing his steps and risking another encounter with the man, or whoever else might be out there, made his stomach churn. Forward was his only option. Ethan pushed off the tree and continued down the trail, his pace slower but deliberate. Scout stayed close, his nose low to the ground. They rounded a bend, and there it was. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its silhouette stark against the surrounding trees. It was old, its wooden exterior weathered and gray, with a sagging roof and windows clouded with grime, opaque like dead eyes. A rickety porch wrapped around the front, its boards warped and splintered. The door creaked open, swaying gently as if inviting them in. Ethan stopped in his tracks. The air around the cabin was unnaturally still, devoid of the usual forest sounds. Not even the wind stirred. His chest tightened as he stared at the structure. It seemed abandoned, yet something about it pulsed with unease as if it were watching him. Scout rumbled a low warning, his ears pinned back. "Easy, boy," Ethan said, though his own voice was shaky. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. The ground beneath his boots sank slightly, damp and yielding, and the smell of damp earth and decay grew stronger with each step. As he reached the edge of the porch, Ethan paused, unsure of his next step. He peered inside through the open door, his flashlight illuminating a sparse interior. The main room was small and cluttered, with a rickety table and chairs, shelves lined with jars, and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. The beam caught on something shiny near the fireplace, a bundle of metal objects that seemed out of place against the otherwise rustic setting. "Stay," Ethan whispered to Scout, motioning for the dog to remain outside. Scout whined but didn't follow as Ethan stepped cautiously onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silence. Inside, the air was heavy and acrid, tinged with an unsettling metallic scent that made Ethan's stomach turn. He moved toward the bundle near the fireplace, his flashlight shaking faintly in his hand. As he got closer, he realized the shiny objects were dog tags, dozens of them, tarnished and scattered haphazardly on the floor. Ethan crouched, his breath hitching as he examined one. The name etched into the metal was unfamiliar, but the date was not. It was from 20 years earlier. He picked up another and another, each one bearing a different name, but similar dates. He looked around the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. Why were they here? What happened to them? A noise behind him made Ethan freeze. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through him. He turned slowly, his flashlight sweeping across the room. The door was still ajar, and Scout was visible just outside, his posture tense. But the sound hadn't come from outside. Ethan stood, clutching the dog tag and flashlight tightly. "Hello?" he called, his voice wavering. The cabin remained silent. Then he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from somewhere behind the shelves. Ethan's beam illuminated jars filled with murky liquid. He stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside the jars were things. At first he couldn't identify them, lumps of something pale and shriveled. But as his flashlight lingered, the shapes became clearer. Small bones, fragments of what looked disturbingly like human remains. A sudden thud from the porch made Ethan whip around, his flashlight swinging wildly. Scout barked sharply, his tense frame motionless at the door. Ethan backed away from the shelves, his breathing ragged. He stepped outside just as a shadow moved across the tree line, disappearing into the darkness. "Time to go," Ethan muttered, his voice trembling. He grabbed Scout's collar and started back toward the trail, his flashlight bouncing wildly with each hurried step. Behind him, the cabin lingered in the shadows, its door open like an unblinking eye. Ethan didn't stop moving until he was far enough from the cabin that the oppressive weight of its presence began to lift. The forest remained dark and silent, but its oppressive weight began to lift the farther he went. Scout trotted close to his side, his ears flicking at every sound, but the dog seemed relieved to be putting distance between them and whatever had been in that cabin. Ethan's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming before stabilizing again. He swore under his breath, realizing he hadn't checked the batteries before heading out. It was the only barrier against the encroaching dark. The trail began to slope downward, the terrain uneven and littered with roots and stones. Ethan slowed his pace to avoid tripping. His thoughts churned relentlessly. The dog tags, the jars in the cabin, the whispered voice. It all felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. Someone or something had left those things there, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had narrowly escaped becoming another name on one of those tags. As the trail leveled out, Ethan stopped to catch his breath. He leaned against a tree, his chest heaving as he tried to calm himself. Scout sniffed at the ground nearby, his tail wagging cautiously, for the first time since they'd left the cabin. Ethan took a moment to look at the map again, unfolding it with trembling hands. The circled locations stared back at him, their meaning clawing at his fragile composure. He traced his finger along the trail he'd been following and realized something alarming. The map showed no sign of the cabin's existence. It should have been marked, given how prominent it was, but there was no indication of its presence. Worse, the next circled location was farther down the trail, and the word scrawled next to it made his stomach drop. Clearing. Ethan folded the map quickly, shoving it into his pocket. He didn't want to go to the clearing, but the trail offered no alternatives. Turning back toward the cabin wasn't an option either. He'd have to keep moving forward and hope he could get through the area quickly. "Let's go, boy," he said to Scout, his voice hoarse. The dog perked up at his tone and fell in step beside him as they continued down the trail. The forest deepened into shadow as they approached the next location. The trees became denser, their twisted branches clawing at the trail like skeletal fingers. A chill crept through the air, and the faint scent of smoke reached Ethan's nose. He paused, sniffing the air. It wasn't the acrid smell of a wildfire, but something more subtle, like the remnants of an extinguished campfire. He rounded a bend and froze. Up ahead, the trees opened into a large clearing. In the center stood a ring of unlit torches surrounding a stone altar. The altar was massive, its surface weathered and cracked, with deep grooves etched into the top. Around it lay scattered belongings, tattered backpacks, dented canteens, and articles of clothing so old they seemed to blend with the earth. Scout growled low, his body tense as he stared at the scene. Ethan advanced cautiously, his flashlight casting long shadows across the clearing. The air here was different, heavier, almost oppressive. Each breath felt like it carried weight, and the silence pressed in, broken only by the faint crunch of his steps on the trail. Ethan approached the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding. He scanned the torches, their bases buried deep in the ground as if they had been there for decades. The altar, too, seemed ancient, its grooves stained with an unidentifiable dark residue. He stepped closer to the altar, his flashlight unsteady in his grip. There was something on its surface, a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. He hesitated. glancing around the clearing, but it was still empty. Slowly he reached out and unwrapped the cloth, revealing what looked like another pendant, similar to the one the man on the trail had mentioned. The pendant was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with the same strange symbols he'd seen earlier on the wooden posts along the trail. As he held it, he noticed a faint humming sensation, as if the object were vibrating softly in his hand. A sudden crackling sound made him spin around, his flashlight darting across the clearing. One of the torches had ignited, its flame flaring to life without warning. Then another and another, until the entire circle was ablaze, casting the clearing in an eerie, flickering light. Ethan clenched the pendant tightly as he backed away from the altar. Scout barked sharply, his hackles raised, but he didn't move from Ethan's side. The flames danced higher, their light casting long, twisting shadows across the trees. And then Ethan saw them. Shapes lurking at the clearing's edge. They were barely visible, their silhouettes blending with the darkness, but they were there, standing motionless, watching. Ethan's flashlight caught a glint of something reflective in the shadows, and his stomach dropped. Eyes. Countless eyes glinting faintly in the flickering flames. "Who's there?" Ethan called, his voice cracking. The figures didn't move. The flames crackled louder, the shadows shifting wildly, but the watchers remained still, their presence suffocating. Scout barked again, but his usual courage faltered, and he pressed himself against Ethan's leg. The silence was broken by a single voice, low, guttural, and unrecognizable. It came from the direction of the altar, though no one stood near it. "You brought it back," the voice said, the words echoing unnaturally in the clearing. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned and bolted back toward the trail, Scout running ahead of him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The sensation of unseen eyes seared into his mind. The shadows of the torches flickered in his peripheral vision, and the sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches followed him, growing fainter the farther he ran. He didn't stop until the forest around him returned to silence, and even then he kept moving, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the clearing. Ethan's legs burned as he forced himself to keep moving. Every step felt heavier, and the forest around him seemed to close in, the shadows thickening around him. Scout stayed close, his ears pinned back and his breathing ragged from exertion. Ethan didn't dare stop, not after what he'd seen in the clearing. The memory of the torches and the figures lurking just beyond the light burned in his mind. He wasn't safe. Not yet. The trail began to slope upward again, forcing Ethan to slow his pace. His flashlight flickered, the beam dimming with every step. "Not now," he muttered under his breath, smacking it against his palm. The light steadied for a moment, then sputtered again. Ethan clenched his jaw, his pulse racing. Without the flashlight, he'd be swallowed by the darkness. Scout let out a low growl, his head snapping toward the trees on their left. Ethan stopped, his heart pounding as he shined his flashlight in the direction Scout was looking. The beam wavered, barely illuminating the tangled underbrush. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw movement, a dark shape weaving through the trees, but it was gone before he could focus. "Let's move, Scout," Ethan whispered, tugging Scout's collar. The dog hesitated, his growl deepening, but eventually followed as Ethan pressed on. He couldn't afford to stay. Whatever lay beyond, staying put wasn't an option. The trail leveled out, and Ethan spotted a subtle shimmer of moonlight piercing the canopy. A surge of relief lifted his spirits. He was getting closer to the edge of the forest. If he could make it to the main ranger station, he could call for help. He needed to stay strong a bit longer. But the surge of relief was fleeting. A biting chill settled around him, and the subtle metallic scent he'd noticed earlier returned, stronger this time. A queasy feeling twisted in Ethan's gut as he pressed a hand against his nose. The scent was more than metallic. It was coppery, reminiscent of blood. He accelerated with Scout staying close by his side. Then he saw it. A subtle shimmer ahead, wavering like distant flames. A sinking feeling hit Ethan. Another open space emerged. "No," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. He hesitated to approach it, but the trail converged straight toward the illumination. Turning back wasn't an option, not with a suffocating sense of being pursued. He had no choice but to keep moving. As he approached the clearing, the details sharpened. This one was smaller than the first, but just as unsettling. A single torch burned in the center, its flame casting long shadows across the surrounding trees. There were no scattered belongings this time, no stone altar, just the torch and the distinct outline of a figure beside it. Ethan froze. The flashlight quivered in his grasp. The figure was tall and slender, its face hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move, didn't react to Ethan's presence. It simply stood there, its silhouette swaying slightly in the torchlight. Scout barked sharply, the sound echoing through the silent forest. The figure's head tilted slightly as though acknowledging them. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised one hand, pointing toward him. The gesture wasn't threatening, it was inviting. Ethan took a step back, his instincts urging him to flee, but before he could move, the figure uttered. Its voice was low and raspy, barely audible over the crackling of the torch. "You can't leave," it said. "Not until it's done." "Stay back," Ethan shouted, raising his flashlight like a weapon. The figure didn't move. Its hand remained outstretched, the gesture unnervingly composed. Scout barked again, more fiercely this time, and Ethan seized the moment to bolt. He didn't look back as he sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The air grew colder, the metallic scent stronger, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Twisted branches snagged at his arms and face as he plunged back into the forest. Scout stayed close, his barks fading into whines as they ran. Ethan's thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. The figure's words reverberated in his mind. "Not until it's done." What did that mean? What had he stumbled into? The trail became steeper, forcing Ethan to reduce his pace. His legs protested with each step, his chest heaving with every breath. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure in pursuit. But there was nothing. The forest was silent once more, except for his labored breathing. As he reached the hilltop, the forest opened slightly, and he saw a subtle light in the distance. It wasn't firelight this time, but an artificial, pale, and steady glow. A surge of relief lifted his spirits. It had to be the ranger station. He was close. "Come on, Scout," he panted, pushing himself forward. The dog seemed to sense the change in Ethan's demeanor and picked up his pace, his tail wagging faintly for the first time in hours. Ethan staggered onto the dirt path leading to the station, his flashlight flickering and dying as he neared the building. The station's exterior lights glowed like a beacon, drawing him forward. He reached the door and pounded on it with both fists, shouting for assistance. The door swung open, and a recognizable face welcomed him. It was Ray, the senior ranger who had assigned Ethan to this section of the forest. Ray's expression morphed from confusion to alarm as he observed Ethan's disheveled appearance. "Ethan? What the hell happened to you?" Ray asked, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan slumped into a chair, his hands trembling as he tried to explain. The words poured out in a frantic torrent about the cabin, the torches, the figure in the clearing. Ray listened, his brow furrowed, but as Ethan spoke, a peculiar look crossed his face. When Ethan concluded, Ray leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "The cabin," Ray said slowly. "Are you sure about what you saw?" "Yes," Ethan snapped. "I'm not making this up. It's out there." Ray was silent for a moment, then stood and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He retrieved a folder and handed it to Ethan. Inside were old photographs and reports, all linked to disappearances in the Appalachian forest. One photo immediately captured Ethan's attention. A picture of the exact cabin he described, dated over 30 years earlier. "That cabin burned down in 1988, Ray said quietly. "There's no way you saw it." A chill of fear rippled through Ethan as he stared at the photo. Before he could respond, Scout rumbled a low growl, his body tensing. Ethan glanced up, following Scout's gaze to the window. Outside, just beyond the glow of the station's lights, stood a figure, hooded and motionless. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. Ethan never spoke about that night again. Some say he managed to resume a semblance of normalcy, but every time he stepped into the woods, the memories of those torches and the figure outside the ranger station would return. And if you ask Ray, he'll tell you this: there are entities beyond our understanding, and once aware of your presence, they never release their grasp. But Ethan couldn't attain tranquility after that night, and some say he still hears faint whispers carried by the rising wind just beyond his window.